Communication is at the very heart of humanity. All of us, at all stages of our lives, are trying to establish communication with our children, with our friends, with strangers, with our colleagues. So communication is all these things. This is transmission of information, of emotions, of ideas, of images, and so on. So today's talk is about communication, the revolution that has come about in communication. Now, I show you this picture. I'm sure it's quite familiar to you. You see young people so much absorbed in their smartphones. It's not only in this particular picture. You see it all over the world. You see it in Japan and China and India. This new technology that has absolutely revolutionized our notion of communication. Now, I'm thankful to you. I must express my gratitude to you as the audience. Nobody so far in my 4 presentations earlier has come to me and said, your statistics are not right. Because I said yesterday, for instance, that the median age in Japan is 45 years. Now, I gave a similar lecture in my undergraduate classes in Canada, and one person in the class, even before I finished my sentence, raised his hand and said, Professor, you're wrong. The median age was 45 last year. To this year, it is 45 and a half. And I said, oh my God, what's going on here? And because even before I had finished my sentence, he had Googled and found out the latest statistics. And this goes on all the time. Every teacher now in the universities particularly is scared of giving any statistics, because the students are a little ahead of you. And the moment you say something, it is already on their network and 1,000 people know about it. So I'm glad that you don't do it, because perhaps you don't care, or perhaps you don't have access to a smartphone or internet here, whatever. I'm glad. I'm thankful to you. Because it happened a year ago in Canada at the University of Calgary. One professor was giving, a dean of particular faculty was giving a convocation address. And in this address, he quoted 6 or 7 lines without giving citation, where these lines come from. He pretended, so it was said, that these were his own lines. This is his own speech. Now, even before he finished his speech, 1,000 people in the university and then across the country knew that he has plagiarized. And when he finished his talk, already people looking, walking, and saying, where did you get these lines from? These are not your lines. And there was a huge scandal in the country. And a week or so later, the man had to resign his job. So communication has, in our present-day times, has become very tricky, because it is now so fast. It moves with the speed of light. And those who want to find out certain information, certain ideas, they find out very quickly. Now, some of you may recall that 1974 was the year of Watergate in USA. And 2 young reporters from Washington Post found out many things about how it happened, and what role perhaps the President Nixon might have played. And there is a line, yesterday there was a movie on our network here. They were talking about Watergate, and they said a reporter is as good as his telephone contacts. This is way back in 1974, 40 years ago. Today, that would be considered the smallest amount of information. Telephone contacts, who cares for telephone contacts? You find so much information about people, about things, about the events from many other sources. And so much so that the European Union just last year decided that we have the right to be forgotten. Right to be forgotten. Because many things stay on the Google for, oh my God, forever. So if some event has occurred, or somebody has said certain things, or certain criminal offense has been committed by someone, people say, well, it is a long time ago. It needs to be forgotten. And so European Union, the courts in the European Union last year made this ruling that, yes, every human being has the right to be forgotten. So it is not forever and ever on the system. So I say this because the communication revolution is impacting on all these things. Now, as I said, that really it's not just happening in Europe or in North America, the technology. It's happening in even what we thought were rather underdeveloped parts of the world. In Africa, in India, in China, everywhere. And here I show you a picture of an older lady in China, in India, and a camel safari man going with his camel and talking on the phone. Now, India, yesterday I mentioned, has 1.2 billion people. And that's, and until about 25 years ago, very few people had landlines, telephones. You had to be quite privileged, quite rich, quite well connected to get a telephone line. And even when those who had it, now our family had it because my father was a lawyer and so on. And so a lot of people in the neighborhood used to come to our home to make a telephone call. It was a very special thing to do. And what was quite interesting, that quite often the telephone didn't work. I mean, you had the line, you paid for it and all that, but it rarely worked well. And the answer you got most often when you made a call to anybody, wrong number. And now India has more than 900 million telephones, cell phones. And the number of people who are contributing more and more are getting it is about increasing by about 60 million every year. So it's truly a revolution, an extraordinary revolution in terms of communication with each other, in the family, with the civil service, with the government, with corporations, and corporations communicating with each other at every level. No revolution, no social revolution comes even close to it. We talk of industrial revolution about 200 years ago, but you didn't see it quite happening right under your feet, as it were. Now this revolution is happening right before us, and we are all involved in it, whether you like it or not. I mean, sometimes I feel I'm a bit of a Neanderthal in communication. I can't use any of the technology that my children use or my students use. But this is certainly there. So here is another example of internet cafe in India of a Coke bottle, and you have internets, and you have a picture of Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, it seems such a strange bit of irony to me, because Gandhi, when he was campaigning for independence of India and the new vision for the country, he was always very suspicious of technology. And he felt that technology sometimes becomes far more important than human beings and humans' well-being. So much so, in 1931, when he visited England, there was a roundtable conference. Charlie Chaplin wanted to meet with him, the great actor, the producer, the most famous man of the times. So Charlie Chaplin, but Gandhi had never heard of him. And so Gandhi, when he was told that this Mr. Chaplin would like to meet with you, he says, "Who is Chaplin? I don't want to see any film people." He had a real aversion to film people. He thought they're a rather immoral bunch. And so when finally they did meet, and the question that Mr. Chaplin asked of Gandhi, is it true that you are against modern technology? And Gandhi's answer was, I'm not against technology, but if it impacts on people adversely, and if it replaces them, and it deprives them of their own dignity and jobs, I'm certainly against them. Now, it's a broad statement. In the last 80 years, of course, much has changed in India, as indeed all over the world in technology. But it's interesting that Charlie Chaplin was so taken by the answer that he made a film on it, and in 1936. And the film is called Modern Times. I don't know if any one of you knows this film. It's a very famous film by Charlie Chaplin, and in which there is a new technology in which there's workers, and he's a worker on the machine, and workers automatically being fed, and he's he's part of the machinery. There's no humanity left in him, and that's the whole film. And Chaplin dedicated the film to Gandhi. And so it's interesting how our history, our attitude towards technology, we keep worrying all the time, as we do now, about artificial intelligence, and I will talk about it shortly. We keep worrying. At what stage does technology take over and our own humanity gets diminished or somehow threatened by it? And so this is as we progress in every walk of technology and industrialization and communication, this question keeps coming up again and again. That's a good question, because we begin to wonder, what is our humanity? And at what stage is our intelligence special? It is the human intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. And can we make computers and machines that are smarter than us? And if they are smarter, where does our own intelligence reside? And so how is it different from the artificial intelligence? So these are questions that are very much being discussed. Here is I want to take you back a little bit, how technology has impacted not only in our everyday communication and transmission, it has had huge impact in wars. And the war technology has changed dramatically, even as we speak. In 1912, about 100 years ago, before the beginning of the First World War, that started in 1914, at that time, New York Times wrote an article, wrote an editorial, which is often referred to even today, because just a few years earlier, aeroplane had been invented. And New York Times wrote that no civilized nation would ever think of using aeroplanes to bombard other countries. No civilized nation would ever think of using aeroplanes to bombard other countries. A year later, 1913, just a year before the war started, it says no civilized country, however we define civilized country, that no civilized country could afford not to use aeroplanes to bombard others. And now, 100 years later, it's not just aeroplanes being used, we use drones. And those drones are being used not by people who are, they're sitting, those who control them, they're sitting 10,000 miles away. They're sitting in Carolina or California, and the drones are being used in Afghanistan or Pakistan. So you see how technology in these 100 years, both not only in human communication, but also in war, a huge amount of it. And many times, many people who say that really so much technology has been encouraged or developed because of war efforts to create more and more fancy weapons. So here, way back in 1860s, during the Civil War in the USA, the war was won by the North. And the people say, what was the special, what contributed a great deal to the winning of the war at that time, in the Civil War? Well, increasingly, as more and more studies are being conducted, we find that the role of the telegraph was very crucial in winning the war. And Lincoln put a huge amount of effort to make sure that through the use of the telegraph, we know exactly the movement of their own soldiers and other equipment, but also of the enemy. And this played a huge role. So some of you may have seen the film Lincoln, and he spends a good deal of time, at most of the hours at night time, in his telegraph office rather than his own room. And so the telegraph played a great role in the Civil War. Which is those who are from the United States. I don't know how many people here are from the United States, but it's been the most devastating war in the American history was the Civil War. At that time, the population of USA was about 8 million. Now it's 330 million. Huge change, colossal change. And the number of people who died in that Civil War, Americans who died in that Civil War, more people died in that Civil War than in all the other wars America has been involved put together. So it was a devastating war, considering the size of the population was so much smaller at that time than it is now. So its telegraph played a very important role. And last year, interestingly, because receiving a telegram when I grew up in India was a scary thing, because it is always a bad news coming. Somebody's died. So and just news. So receiving somebody knocking at your door as there's a telegram was always a fearful thing to receive. So last year in India, the telegraph office was closed. This is the last time they said nobody's receiving telegrams anymore. Who receives telegrams? Telegraphy is finished. It's passé because of the new system technology. So when we go back and say what steps have been taken in the history of technology and what impact they've had at different times. Here is another example I give you. Because it has not only impacted our communication, it has impacted on our notion of what is private and what is public. What is the mystique you create? If you don't know something about somebody, you have no way of knowing about it, you create mystique and all kinds of mystique. This story I showed to you is from Japan. Japan on 15th of August 1945 surrendered. This is soon after the use of the 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atom bombs. And this is the first time that it surrendered, and there were negotiations going on. And this is the first time that the people in Japan heard the voice of their emperor. And the voice came on the radio. And he's announcing that Japan is surrendering. And people were crying. And what was amazing, in some of the photographs here you see, people are bowing before the radio. They're sitting there because for them, emperor was God. He was godlike. He was divine. And here they're bowing before the radio as the voices that are coming from heaven. And this emperor is speaking, and they were crying because, for any country to surrender is a shameful act. It is it's a sad time. And so I show this picture to you because the surrender of Japan on 15th of August 1945, just after the dropping of the 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the people never knowing who is our emperor, where he hides. There was a huge mystique about him. Now, these days, that kind of mystique about anybody is evaporated. We saw how it happened to Bill Clinton as president, how people were digging up all kinds of information and images and photographs and this and that. So it is not possible to have mystique about people. And one of the things that has come about in the last 20, 30 years, that so many people who were so revered by the public at large, because we sometimes didn't know a whole lot about them. We revered them. We thought they were grand, they were wonderful. That there is a whole new tendency now to find that every human being has feet of clay. That they're not so grand. They may be so grand in one area, but they're not so grand in another area. They have feet of clay. They are human after all. Their humanity is being exposed. And 1 or 2 people, I give you examples so we can move on here. 2 people. Thomas Jefferson, one of the great presidents of USA. And highly revered for his contribution to the making of the Constitution and his eloquence, and he's a man of enlightenment, and he's a man of father of American independence. And here, then, so many people not digging up dust about him. And he said, well, he was a great president, a great man, great human being, but look at him. He had so many slaves. At a time when people talk, all men are born equal. And then he had so many. He fathered. He became a widower at the age of 37, and he lived a long life. And he, like some of us men do stupid things, he gave a vow to his dying wife that I'll never marry again. Now that does not mean that you won't have a relationship with other women. You won't marry them. So he didn't marry a black woman, and he had fathered 5 children with her. And it all came out in the last 30, 40 years. We didn't know. Or if people did know, they didn't talk about it, didn't write about it. So you find there's a new way, this whole idea of communication and digging up dirt, if you like, or digging up more information about people and really proving that they're grand in some ways, but not so grand in every way. Now, same thing is being done about Mahatma Gandhi. A recent book just came out. It was reviewed in Wall Street Journal, saying Gandhi was not as pure sexually as it is made out to be, that he was bisexual, that he was, and so in India where there are a lot of gay people, but nevertheless they're sort of hidden underground. So now to have a person who's highly revered for a long time in many countries all over the world, they have recently installed his statue in the Parliament Square in London. And so to now dig up that kind of dirt about him. And it seemed it is a new way of really asserting that we can find information. Some letter here, some reference here, something here and something there. And so we can find information which was otherwise hidden. And so I'll quickly move on before I take just one more quick example. During the Second World War, there was something quite atrocious that Japan did. It used about 200,000 young women as comfort women, as prostitutes. And they were called comfort women. And these girls were between the age of 18, 19, with 25, under 25. And they were from all the neighboring countries. Yesterday I mentioned to you why so few people emigrate to Japan. And this is one of the factors that has contributed to it. So these comfort women, 200,000 of them, used by Japanese army for their soldiers, for the comfort of their soldiers. They came from China, or Philippines, or Korea. Some came further back from Singapore. So they were, and after the war was over, they went back to their homelands. But Japan never acknowledged that these women were ever used, that such a phenomenon, such an institution ever existed. And even to this day, they keep denying it or even or acknowledge at all very half-heartedly. So a few years ago, about 10 years ago, two of my students at the University of Toronto, of Korean origin, they decided, they had read about it, heard about it. They decided they want to find out what happened to those women. Because many of these women were living really underground, because they were not accepted by their own society. This is Asian value. Hey, once a woman has been sexually defiled, she's not accepted. She's defiled. She's a rotten fruit. And so here they were, two of my students at the University of Toronto, students of political science. They said, we'll find out where these women are. And I thought, this is remarkable. They raised money, and then they brought 10 of these women to Canada. They were literally in their 70s, some in their 80s, and say, well, tell us your story. And it became a great phenomenon in Canada, great exposure that these women who had been denied all these years and Japan had denied, suddenly through this new technology, new ways of digging up information, that made it that it is now, the history is being rewritten by not necessarily those who are in power, but those who feel that they've been marginalized, been left out from the banquet table of history. So all these things are part of the communication revolution. Let's move on. So I mentioned to you about Watergate in 1974. I remember visiting a small farm in India at the time, and this man applying his land in a traditional way, as has been done for centuries, and he had a transistor set hanging from the horn of the bull. And the transistor set, as it was approaching, was announcing that President Nixon is going to be impeached. And it's coming out, and I thought to myself, here's a whole new world opening to this man who had probably never traveled more than 20 kilometers. And suddenly the world is opening, coming from who is Nixon? Where is America? Where is this, what is impeachment? And so it's impacting on the notion of politics or power, who exercises power, how is it exercised. And so suddenly those walls that people have built over the centuries about what is the ruling classes, who exercises power and how, suddenly they're beginning to seem a little soft. And this example comes to me because I saw this man, this kind of farmer, there's not exactly this person, farmer, using a new technology, a transistor set. Now, it's not a huge radio, but it's a small little thing. And the transistor has small little transistors brought about the kind of change we now see on a grander scale on smart telephones. Let's move on. So here, traditionally, again going back, everybody, as I mentioned earlier, we have the human gift of language. That is our special gift. That doesn't matter where a child is born, he or she has this gift for language. Remarkable gift. And then I also shared with you how one learns what language one uses or speaks, what is spoken to the child. And so a Chinese child, a Korean child, an English child, so they use their language. So, but not many people had the gift of writing the language or reading the language. That came much later. So firstly, it's about 5,000 years ago. that our first script was invented. That it is possible now, what is the sound now being written down and expressed in images. Remarkable transformation, remarkable transfer. We don't think of it, so, we get sometimes blasé about the changes that have come about. But it is remarkable how sound we hear, how it can be turned into images. And it started by certain images in Egypt, and it was about 5,000 years ago. Since then, of course, every language has its own script and its own way of expressing how far it come about. So before that, there was such an oral tradition. Oral tradition. You spoke, you sang, and it's passed on from one to the other, and sometimes with certain changes, and sometimes a lot of changes. So I find, as an example, that so many of religious scriptures in the Asian tradition, in Indian tradition, or Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam, they are not in prose, but in poetry. Why is it so? I often wonder, why is it so? Because poetry is easier to remember. It's easier to recite, and it's easier to share. Whereas you can't, you have to be a very good theater actor to remember huge pieces of prose. But poetry, you recite. It's easier to share. And so if you write your scriptures or other books in prose, in poetry, that it becomes a much easier thing to share. And that's how the oral tradition has been very important in many countries, because how is a certain formula, how do you cook, how do you make a building, how do you do agricultural practices, many of them expressed passed on from one generation to another generation to another generation orally, because people didn't know how to read and write. And even, it's only in the last 150 years that more and more people are beginning to read and write. And now it has become a sign of development. I say, how many women have literacy? How many people go to school? These are signs of our development. But earlier, really, even at the time of French Revolution, about 200 years ago in 1780s, about more than 70% people could not write their name. They could not write their name. Tomorrow is Mother's Day. I should just share with you. My mother could not write her name. She was completely unlettered. She was born about 4 years ago now. And it was not at all unusual for many women particularly not to have any literacy. And I dedicated my book, one of my books to her, called To My Unlettered Mother. So it really, in a way, it is a great gift of development, of literacy, to be able to read and to be able to write and share. But earlier, the importance of oral tradition in different societies. Now, here is people use this term for Semitic religion, 3 religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So these are the people of the book. Interesting. They're people of the book, because their book is what defines their sense of what is right, what is wrong. And it becomes holy, and that's why many times those of us who may or may not believe in something, we say, why does people, Islamic people, Muslim people, keep referring to Quran that decide what was said in there, and that's what we'll do now. That was written 1,500 years ago. Why is it so important now in the 21st century? So, but people of the book felt the book decides what is right and wrong, and is carried on. Now, the Eastern religions don't have a book that decides. And Buddhism does not have a book. There are books that are, but they are not such central to Buddhism. Same is true of Hinduism. Same is true of Jainism. So if we find the book, the idea of the people of the book. Now, in some ways, we are all people of the book now, because we all read, and books have become fascinating. Here is an example of how a person say, there's a debate going on, are books going to disappear? Are they going to pass it? And so many people say, no, books are so crucial to snuggle with a book, to read a book. It gives you a sense of privacy and ownership, and so on. So this is the idea, who are the people of the book? And then this idea, every movement, whether it's a Marxism has its own book, or it's a socialist, or certain ideas in sociology or political science and so on, or literature. We find, say, certain books that have really brought about a huge amount of cultural evolution and changes in the society. Now, as a light-hearted joke, now before the printing press came in the 15th century, those who were joining the monasteries or trying to be a monk or a priest, the part of the job was to always copy the Bible or copy the Quran, because otherwise how else could copies be made? So you spend time copying it, and that's hand copies. So a young man joins the joins the monastery, and he's given the same task. So he questions the chief priest. He says, what I'm copying, is it correctly been passed down to me, or is there some mistake somewhere? And so he says, no, you just do what you've been told. And then a few days pass by, and the chief priest comes, and he looks very worried. He says, well, we have been doing something wrong. We have been writing this word celibate. In fact, the word should be celebrate. You see, and I say this a little lightheartedly because a few years ago, a book came out which created a huge uproar. And it was banned. A fatwa was issued against it. And there was a death threats against the author, Salman Rushdie. He wrote a book called Satanic Verses. And I don't know how many of you know this book. It came out in 1989. And the Satanic Verses says it really is a satire. It makes fun of Prophet Muhammad. And Prophet Muhammad, some of you may know, the way the Quran, the holy book, is written. He's supposed to go to the mountaintop, and the angel speaks to him, and then he comes down, and he dictates it. That's what I heard, and it became the Quran. And so in the Satanic Verses, the man who's writing it down, what is being told to him by Prophet Muhammad, he makes fun of it. He changes the verses. And he puts on all kinds of things which are not supposedly originally there. So it becomes not a holy book. It becomes Satanic Verses. It works the work of Satan. And so it is written as a satire, but it created such an uproar in 1989 when it was published. So you can see how this notion of what is passed down, and every religion now, we're revisiting some of the concepts of what is to be, what is holy, what is authentic, what is to be obeyed, what is to be passed on, so on. But these are questions that are certainly part of the communication revolution. Now, I quickly go over it here. Oh my God, time is going by. The whole revolution is the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. They all had impact on the population. I mentioned yesterday how the population started growing quite rapidly in the beginning of the industrial revolution. So we've got to move on. So you have an agricultural revolution. You have a printing press is first printing press in 1450s in Göttingen in Germany, and then how it spread. It is a very huge step in communication, that the copies of the book can be made and can be passed on, and that people can share their ideas, their information, and science and technology and whatever and whatever. And it was a revolutionary step. And I was a student of one of the great persons who studied media at the University of Toronto, Marshall McLuhan, and he talked about global village and how it, in a way, it has been in the making. Our world is becoming a village because we are connecting with more and more people. And this started, he traces it back to the beginning of printing press in 1450. Very crucial step. And many people were threatened by it. So what kind of books will be published? The idea of censorship. The Vatican had, until quite recently, a whole set of list of books which were banned over the centuries. And so this idea that now printing press is beginning to threaten the people's notion of what is acceptable, the notion of obedience, and the notion of what should be shared, what should not be shared with other people. Okay. And so I mentioned this industrial revolution at various steps. You've got to move faster. Electric revolution. How we generate electricity as a way of communicating. But you see, you have the electrical revolution, the various tools, various machines, various mediums that were created that are electrical in nature. A light bulb. I've gone in many parts of the world where there's still electricity is not there, and or if there, it is only for 2 hours, 3 hours a day. But we take for granted now in many many Western countries, it's take for granted that electricity is, but it is now made it possible that changing the notion of what is day and what is night, because for a long time our life cycle, our lifestyle was really impacted by the day and night. If it is dark, well, you sleep, and if it is day, well, you work. But now people can work any time of the day and night, and people do. People can read, people can create things, and so on. So our notion of what is creativity, what is possible, has been changed again. Now, here, again, part of the communication revolution, what steps have taken throughout the centuries. All this leading to computer communication, that is the focus of our talk today. And then various tools that have come about. There are people now, my children, my two daughters, who are now 23 and 26, they have never even seen a typewriter. I said, my God, this is amazing. They have not even seen a typewriter. And so there are many things that we grew up with and thought was the electrical typewriter, and then carbon copies, and then what kind of other things that came about. And so many tools that have changed so rapidly. Nothing in the human history has changed so fast as the tools for communication have changed. Listening to a radio together as though messages are coming from another world. I recall many years ago in Sri Lanka, a small little radio, a television put on top of a tree so that people cannot fiddle, and whole crowd of people, about 200 people in the village gathered around to see this show. They had never seen television pictures before. And what was the show? I Love Lucy. And so you see how suddenly the world images coming from other parts of the world. How do people dress? What do they look like? What do they eat? What is their ritual? So suddenly you don't have to be an anthropologist to go to other countries to share your knowledge. Suddenly images are coming, sounds are coming, pictures are coming, people are coming, and suddenly the world is becoming global. It's expanding in every direction. And the role of television, again, I'm sure people of our age here have seen how important television was and how people gathered around and how it is changing now. So electronic revolution, the coming of the conductors, semiconductors in the 1950s, and then superconductors. All this is all in the last 50, 60 years and rapidly changing. And the fax machine, I remember seeing a fax machine for the first time and not believing, is it possible that you send a picture and at the other end you're receiving it? And I'm sure all of us have experiences. And the man who must be acknowledged in some ways is Bill Gates. And his talk about how information is traveling with the speed of light. Really, and in every sense of that word. Now, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, there was a big earthquake in Nepal. You see, the earthquake that occurred, I mentioned to you earlier, in Lisbon in 1755, who saw it? Nobody saw it. Nobody heard it. And people traveled, they gave their own version of what happened. And now we see it happening so fast, right over our eyes, and within seconds, all over the world. And so there's literally information and ideas and images traveling with the speed of light and making people realize our humanity in a manner which you could not possibly imagine even 25, 30 years ago. So then the artificial intelligence. A lot of research being done in this area in many countries, that computers that are smarter than us, can they play? You play a chess game, can a computer defeat some of the great chess masters? And how is it then? What is the notion? How do we make decisions? What is human intelligence in compared to artificial intelligence? And this is an area which is threatening to a lot of people. If computers can do it, if a machine can do it, then what is special about us humans? The notion of human creativity and so on. I've got to skip it faster. Now, one area where computers and new technology, computer technology, is being talked about and being used extensively and remarkably is in the field of medicine. How an image taken here can be transmitted to somebody way back in another country, and for information, for consultation, for a new way of getting other opinion about what is happening to this particular. So you have in medical technology, it's really coming on a grand scale of mapping the brain. I have a lecture on the brain another time, and how mapping the brain, how seeing the images of actually as we think of something, how the brain waves can be seen on a machine, on a screen, and so on. So this is something new that is really being shared and being done and being explored more and more. So the social media. Now I have no Twitter account. I don't know how to use Facebook, but I'm absolutely overwhelmed by what goes on in these areas, and how people put pictures and talks. I'm trying to put some of my talks on YouTube. I don't know how to do it, so I'm always looking for some younger person to help me out. And but really, social media has changed the notion of what is private. What is private and what is public. And people talk about cyber bullies. Taking somebody's picture unknowingly or without his or her knowledge and putting for the whole world to know. And is that fair? Is that right? Is that legal? And what does it do? There are some cases in the last year or so where some young girls have committed suicide because they feel exposed to the world. Their pictures have been taken in rather uncompromising positions, sexual or otherwise. And so this new kind of bullies, cyber bullies, where you threaten a person's privacy or certain sense of being or certain sense of decency or certain sense of shame or honor. You see, we talk about honor killing. In some societies, people feel you have dishonored me, so I cannot bear to see you around. You must die. And this idea of honor, what is our sense of honor and shame, is being redefined, and our sense of privacy because of this new technology. So here, then, I feel this World Wide Web, WWW, their idea is WWW, every worldwide, as though we are part of a larger web, a spider's web, in which nobody can escape. Everybody's in it, on it, part of it. And one country, about 100 years ago, Soviet Union, as a communist country, they tried to curtail information going in, information going out, some music coming in or not coming in, some novels. And the term that was used called Iron Curtain. They put an Iron Curtain. And, well, it worked because really so much modern technology didn't exist. Some people smuggled certain books, certain music, but on the whole, they kept the country, the whole empire, as it were, under wraps. But nowadays, nobody can think of doing it. No, it's not possible to do it. And China, a few years later, used the word called bamboo curtain, as though we can curtail what will go out and not go out. Then whole new technology has made it say it is accessible, it is reachable, it cannot be breached. And if anybody, any government, any group of people try to hide it, well, too bad, it won't work. Because a lot of people now talk of human rights. It's my right, it's my freedom, I must use it, I must have access to it. And so increasingly, this our notion of what can be hidden away by the governments, by the corporations, by families, that is changing. And sometimes for good reasons, for good things. Other times it can be quite frightening. So this whole idea of, I mentioned earlier, right to be forgiven. Right to be forgiven. That's an amazing concept. Right to be forgiven. Nobody had ever even thought about this idea, the right to be forgiven. You heard people commit crime and then they say, well, after a while the records will be deleted. So you no longer, criminal records are no longer there. But certainly, if they are there on Google or they're on the internet and people wish to access it, they dig it out, especially in interviews. I caution my young students, please don't do anything silly and have pictures, because they'll be there forever. And when you go for an interview, they know it before you get there. So, and it'll ruin your career. And if you have any idea of going into politics, it will certainly destroy you. Because there are a lot of people out to dig up dirt on you. So please don't do it, because this is a different world, a different way of relating to each other. So there is a huge different idea of blasphemy. People taste it's blasphemous. And many religious people in Islam, they're still hanging on to old ideas of what is blasphemous. In Pakistan, there are laws against blasphemy, and they can be very serious. So the ideas linger on because we haven't stepped into the 21st century. And so people of one kind of people who are still stuck in the 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, they're trying to make laws for the 21st century. And of course there'll be clash, because there are different new people thinking differently, and this different notion of what is right and what can be shared. Now, the big brother, as I mentioned to you already, cyberbullying and cyber romance and private self, public self, self-image, all these are really under great change. And I've got to conclude, because everyone is talking, but is anyone listening? Really. I mean, more and more people, it's a strange thing, we don't know quite, more and more people feel lonely today than ever before. There is more depression in the world than perhaps been ever been noticed before. More people feel unconnected to their own members of the family than people have ever mentioned before. So there is, on one hand, extraordinary amount of sharing of information and ideas and images and pictures and so on. On the other hand, feeling unconnected, feeling not a lack of intimacy, lack of human intimacy, warmth. So it's a strange thing that we are left with, a strange thing. I don't know the answer, but it's certainly a lot of people are concerned that how come our children come home for Christmas dinner, all they're doing is looking at this and not talking to anybody. They're on the computer. Where is it? Where is the dinner? Where is the conversation? Where is the warmth? Where is laughing? Where is sharing? Is really, in some ways, we have to rediscover humanity, our own humanity, our own presence in the community. Because I don't know, nobody wants to do away with the machines. Machines are good. These communication things are wonderful. But are they threatening our humanity, our sense of connecting with each other, our relationship with each other? I think, and people, sometimes there was a scene in a television show called Sex and the City, in which the guy, a man and woman are lying, and they're supposed to be making love, but the man is more interested in watching the TV where they're making love rather than making love. So virtual sex has become more fascinating than real sex. I don't know. Maybe some of you have answers. Thank you.